the stark Northumberland winter of 1819, amidst the windswept moors surrounding the quiet parish of Coldstream, a young life was not lost, but traded. A girl of 13, little more than a child, was sold into matrimony to settle the catastrophic gambling debts of her father. What followed was not a union of hearts, but a methodical descent into chattel existence, a chronicle of unchecked cruelty, and an ultimate silent act of murder. This is the disquieting history of Isolde Thorne, a figure known to the ages only as the Widow of Coldstream. If the anatomy of psychological horror, forgotten histories, and the chilling ambiguities of justice intrigue you, subscribe to Rite of Fear, ring the notification bell, and join us as we excavate the darkest corners of the human past. In the biting winter of 1819, in the market town of Coldstream, Northumberland, the Thorne family found itself utterly ruined. The architect of their downfall was not an act of God or a failed harvest, but the reckless compulsions of its patriarch, Marcus Thorne. Once a man of modest respectability whose name carried some small weight in local commerce, Marcus had become infamous in the gaming dens and taverns from Alnwick to Berwick upon Tweed. His wagers grew from reckless to ruinous, fueled by a desperation that clung to him like the scent of stale ale and cheap tobacco. By the year's end, his accumulated debts vastly eclipsed the combined value of his small farmstead and household, a sum that represented generations of quiet, honest work. Contemporaneous accounts and creditors' ledgers document him as a man hollowed out by vice, a specter at the card table who risked not merely coin, but the very security of all who depended upon him. When the final demands for repayment were issued, their tones no longer patient but sharp with threat. Marcus Thorne had exhausted every resource. His fields were mortgaged to their last acre, his credit obliterated, and his name was a byword for unreliability, spoken with a mix of pity and contempt. His tarnished reputation left him with a single final asset left to bargain with: his daughter, Isolde. She was just 13 years old. By the letter of the law, she was a child, still years from womanhood, but by the brutal calculus of social custom and financial desperation, she was a commodity of considerable value. Her father, acutely aware of this last terrible card he had left to play, leveraged her as his final piece of collateral. The chosen groom was a man named Alistair Finch, aged 29, the master of a nearby estate known as Blackwood Manor. Finch's lineage, though respectable, was a facade hiding its own financial fragility. His estate desperately required an injection of funds, or at the very least, the absorption of assets to stabilize its decline. The Thorne connection, despite its public ruin, offered something more crucial: an easy, legally binding means to seize control over another household's remaining property through marriage, and the grim satisfaction of a bargain struck from a position of absolute power. The resulting agreement was a creature born of neither affection nor negotiation between equals. It was a pure settlement, a cold balancing of account ledgers where a human life was the final entry. On a frigid December evening, by the flickering, greasy light of tallow candles in a Coldstream solicitor's office, Marcus Thorne signed a document that extinguished his debts. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old paper, leather-bound books, and the unspoken shame of the moment. In exchange for his financial freedom, he signed away his daughter's entire future witnesses. The solicitor and his clerk later noted that Marcus's hand trembled so violently that he nearly dropped the quill. They could not discern if it was from the effects of drink, the biting shame of his actions, or the profound relief of his own deliverance. Alistair Finch's signature followed, inscribed in a steady, precise, and deliberate script. The clean, sharp penmanship of a man closing a satisfactory business deal, utterly devoid of emotion. The contract was comprehensive in its cruelty, a masterpiece of legal dehumanization. Isolde's dowry was structured not as a gift to the new union but as a direct payment against her father's outstanding obligations to Finch and his associates. The terms mandated her immediate transfer to the Finch household within a matter of weeks. Critically, Isolde herself was absent from these proceedings. Her voice, her consent, her very existence as a person with agency never entered the legal record. The document stated she was hereby conveyed, a phrase that speaks less of matrimony and more of the transfer of property. This legal framework was a dark cornerstone of 19th century marital arrangements for many. Daughters were openly and frequently treated as instruments of financial settlement, their futures bartered to secure family alliances or, in this case, to erase the debts of a feckless man. For Isolde, the moment of her life's great turning passed without her knowledge. That night she slept, unaware, in her small cold bed at the Thorne home, her breathing soft in the chilled air. Her fate had already been sealed in drying ink. She did not know that her father, in the suffocating shadow of his losses, had gambled her life as recklessly as he had ever wagered his coin. She did not know that Alistair Finch, a man 16 years her senior whom she had never met, now held the legal right and social expectation to claim her as his wife. The true cruelty lay not just in the contract itself, but in its deliberate concealment. Isolde would only be informed once the arrangements were irrevocable, her protests, should she have any, rendered meaningless by the signatures of powerful men and the unyielding authority of the law. Thus, in the final frost-bitten days of 1819 in Coldstream, Northumberland, a childhood was summarily ended without ceremony. It was extinguished not by death or illness, but by a simple, sordid financial transaction. Isolde Thorne's life was sold into marriage before she could even begin to grasp its terrible terms. On a gray, overcast morning in January 1820, the ancient stones of the Coldstream Parish Church seemed to weep with condensation. The cavernous space was filled with a strained, unnatural silence instead of the joyous murmur of a wedding. The bells tolled but heavily, their peals sounding not as heralds of love, but as instruments of grim, inexorable duty. Among the sparsely assembled guests, a discomfiting mix of Finch's creditors with satisfied smirks, nervous family acquaintances avoiding each other's eyes, and senior members of the Finch estate staff appraising their new mistress, the atmosphere was palpably tense. Everyone present understood with varying degrees of complicity that the union about to be sanctified was not the fruit of affection, but the stark conclusion of a brutal bargain. Isolde Thorne, barely 13, entered the church on her father's arm. His grip was tight, more restraining than supportive. Observers who later recorded the day's events described her as wraith-like, her face pale and bewildered under a simple bonnet. Her small frame seemed lost within her ill-fitting dress, a garment of plain wool clearly not made for her. She moved as if in a trance, her feet shuffling forward. She neither spoke nor looked up at the congregation. Her silence was not the product of maidenly modesty, but of a profound, paralyzing incomprehension. A child forced into a ritual whose meaning she could not yet interpret, her mind struggling to catch up with the catastrophe that had befallen her. At the altar stood Alistair Finch, 29, a tall and rigid figure already defined by the stern, unforgiving features that would characterize his reputation in Northumberland. His estate, though diminished, still commanded a degree of respect in the county, and he wore that respect like a suit of armor. His demeanor that morning reflected not a groom's anticipation, but a landowner's thinly veiled irritation, as if the proceedings were merely a tiresome but necessary chore to be endured before he could claim his newly acquired assets. Witnesses later remarked on the moment the vast disparity between the bride and groom became painfully, unforgettably clear. When Isolde reached the altar steps, Alistair looked down at her, his gaze traveling from her simple shoes to her bowed head, not with courtesy or even curiosity, but with an undisguised, chilling disdain. He muttered a single phrase, audible to those closest to him, including his own footman and the vicar's attendant. "Scarcely a dowry, barely a woman." The cruelty of this remark lay in its public timing, not whispered in private, but uttered before the clergy and the few assembled guests. It established the grim, loveless nature of their marriage before it had even officially commenced, branding her as inadequate from the very first moment. The vicar, a man whose weary face showed he was long accustomed to the formalities of his office regardless of the circumstances, proceeded without hesitation, his voice a monotone drone. The unwavering ancient words of the Book of Common Prayer filled the cold, damp air, echoing slightly against the stone pillars. The congregation followed mechanically, their voices subdued, seemingly reluctant to lend volume to a ceremony they could not, in good conscience, celebrate. Isolde remained speechless. Her required responses, "I will," were whispered, barely audible even to the vicar, her voice a thread of sound nearly lost in the cavernous space. Her fear, her youth, and her lack of comprehension combined to render her presence more symbolic than participatory. She was present in body but utterly absent in power. Alistair's responses, in stark contrast, were firm, clear, and projected with an almost defiant audibility. He recited the vows with a chilling precision, his voice measured, his eyes never softening as they rested on the small, trembling figure before him. The transaction was being completed in his tone as much as in his words. This was the final seal on his acquisition. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife, but the exchange offered no gesture of tenderness, no semblance of partnership. There was no kiss, only a brief dismissive touch of his hand on her arm to turn her from the altar. Guests noted the palpable unease that settled over the church like a shroud. Some averted their gaze from the bride's bowed head. Others stiffened at the groom's visible, unapologetic contempt. Yet not a single person protested. The contract was signed, the debt was settled, and the law of both church and state had sanctified the arrangement. To question it would have been to challenge the very structure of a society that viewed daughters as negotiable property and marriage as a practical tool of commerce. When the ceremony concluded, the bells rang again, their sound echoing hollowly across the frost-covered churchyard. There were no cheers, no flowers strewn, no laughter at the gate. There was only the dull, silent procession of obligation, a ritual performed to conclude a financial transaction. The records of that day leave no description of Isolde's expression, noting only that she walked beside her new husband in a complete, unnerving silence, her steps dictated by those around her rather than by her own will. Alistair's face was a mask of stone, his jaw firm, his gaze fixed forward already onto the next matter of business. The marriage was sealed, its vows were binding, yet affection was entirely, demonstrably absent. The church bells, the witnesses knew, had tolled not for love but for a debt repaid. The marriage of Isolde Thorne and Alistair Finch, solemnized in the chilling air of January 1820, produced no shared life, no period of adjustment, no semblance of a partnership. It was a legal fiction from the moment the vicar spoke the words. Within a mere fortnight of the ceremony, Alistair departed. His stated purpose was a vague and convenient mix of business and pleasure, with various accounts and letters from his associates mentioning visits to London's gaming clubs, extended stays in the fashionable spa town of Bath where he engaged in social and romantic pursuits, and later, continental travel. Records from the period strongly imply this prolonged absence was not a matter of urgent business but of deliberate, calculated preference. Its consequence for his new wife was immediate and profound. A bride abandoned without acknowledgement, companionship, or guidance, left to rattle around a vast and unfamiliar house like a forgotten piece of furniture. The Finch estate at Coldstream, known as Blackwood Manor, was an imposing structure, built of dark, weathered stone that seemed to absorb the bleak Northumberland light. The house was vast, a labyrinth of high-ceilinged rooms, narrow, drafty corridors, and numerous unused chambers collecting dust and shadows. For a 13-year-old girl freshly removed from the modest Thorne home, a place of small rooms and familiar comforts, the estate offered not grandeur but a profound and terrifying vacancy. Its sheer, echoing space amplified her silence and her burgeoning isolation, making her feel smaller and more insignificant with each passing day. The long, unlit hallways seemed to swallow sound, and the portraits of Finch's ancestors that lined the walls watched her with stern, judgmental eyes. Servants later observed that Isolde was quartered not in the master's suite or the adjacent mistress's chambers, but in a small, remote room in a disused wing of the manor. The room resembled a forgotten nursery, furnished with small, faded pieces that seemed to belong to a much younger child. A small bed, a worn rocking horse in the corner with one eye missing, and wallpaper peeling to reveal the darker plaster beneath. This deliberate placement reinforced her ambiguous and powerless position. She was present in name as Mrs. Finch, but she was not yet recognized or to be treated as the mistress of the household. She was, in effect, being stored away like a winter coat until she might, if ever, become useful. The household staff, led by a stern and unsmiling housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, later recalled that Alistair had left no specific instructions for Isolde's care beyond the provision of basic meals and the expectation of strict discipline. "She is to be kept out of the way," was the only directive the housekeeper received. Isolde was to remain confined to the estate's rooms and its sprawling walled gardens. She received no invitations from neighboring families who were unsure of her status, and Alistair had granted her no formal introduction to county society. To the outside world, she was effectively invisible, a rumor attached to a name. Whispers soon began to circulate among the servants, the only human contact she had. They quickly ceased referring to her as Mrs. Finch or even the mistress. At first she was the child, but as her silent, aimless wanderings became a feature of the household, a new name took hold. She became the ghost. One young maid later testified during the inquiry that Isolde would drift through the long dark halls with the air of a shadow, seen but seldom heard, her feet making no sound on the heavy carpets. Others described her presence as spectral, a child adrift in corridors too large and grand for her small frame. In their private conversations in the kitchens and stables, she was the ghost wife, a title that carried less malice than a deep, unsettling pity. It confirmed the shared perception that she was entirely excluded from the life her marriage was supposed to have promised, a living specter in her own home. This kind of isolation had social precedent. Underage brides among the landed families of 19th century England were often sequestered, kept out of sight until they were deemed old enough or suitable for public presentation. This arrangement allowed their husbands to pursue business, politics, or personal diversions without the social inconvenience of a child spouse. What was exceptional in Isolde's case, however, was the utter absence of any preparation or transition. She was not being educated by a governess for her future role in society. She was not being groomed for her duties as a wife and mother. She was simply being left warehoused in a cold room, her development and well-being a matter of complete indifference to the man who legally owned her. Her days within the estate merged into a gray, indistinct routine, a featureless landscape of time. She occupied herself with reading when she could find books in the dusty, neglected library, or with needlework when supplies were provided. But accounts suggest that much of her time passed in profound, unnerving silence, without instruction or human companionship. The servants maintained a professional and at times fearful distance. Their loyalty and their livelihoods rested firmly with their absent master, Alistair. not with the silent child he had brought into the household and promptly abandoned. To be seen as too friendly to her might be perceived as a betrayal. From the outside, the neighbors of Coldstream observed only absence. The marriage that had fueled so much local gossip produced no visible union. Alistair was seen at social gatherings in Bath and London, his name occasionally appearing in society pages detailing his attendance at balls and races. Isolde was not seen at all. The gross imbalance of their years was compounded by the imbalance of their power, a power Alistair enforced through distance and neglect. At 13, Isolde possessed no allies, no resources, and no authority. At 29, Alistair wielded absolute control through a policy of deliberate clinical indifference. This form of abandonment reduced their marriage to its barest legal function, a contract without companionship, a legal bond without a shred of recognition or human warmth. One clergyman in a later letter to his bishop described Isolde's condition as a living widowhood. She bore the name and title of a wife, a name that conferred certain legal obligations upon her, but she enjoyed none of its protections or privileges. She was a prisoner of her own status. Thus, the union of Thorne and Finch entered into under the heavy weight of debt, quickly dissolved into a silent, one-sided ordeal. The child bride was left to wander the hollow, echoing rooms of Blackwood Manor, unclaimed, unacknowledged, and unseen. She was a wife in name, but a ghost in truth. But her only companions were the creaks and groans of the old house, and the silent, watching eyes of the Finch ancestors in their gilded frames. When Alistair Finch returned to Coldstream in the autumn of 1820, the household atmosphere shifted from a state of cold vacancy to one of active oppression. His absence had been marked by a chilling indifference. His presence, it turned out, was marked by a methodical and practiced cruelty. Observers, primarily the household servants, noted a change not in affection, which had never been offered but in the application of his authority. The deep, vacant silence that had once surrounded Isolde was now replaced by commands. Sharp, constant, and unrelenting Alistair, at 29, possessed both the social authority and the physical dominance over a wife who had only just turned 14. The change in her since he had last seen her was minimal. She was still a slight, underdeveloped girl. This gross imbalance became starkly visible in the household's daily routines. Isolde, who by custom should have been gently trained for the duties of a mistress, learning to manage household accounts, plan menus, and oversee staff, was instead conscripted into labor resembling that of the lowest-ranking servant. She was made to scrub the cold stone floors of the main hall on her hands and knees, haul heavy buckets of cold water from the well in the courtyard, wash heavy linens in harsh lye soap that reddened her hands, and polish Alistair's many pairs of boots until they shone. Each menial task was assigned with a deliberate, pointed emphasis, seemingly intended not for the practical maintenance of the house, but for the systematic erosion of her dignity and status. The servants' accounts, collected later during the official inquiry, described the pattern clearly and with a chilling consistency. Orders were given in tones of open mockery rather than necessity. When Isolde faltered, her small hands struggling with a heavy bucket of coal for the fire, Alistair would remark loudly upon her clumsiness and weakness. When she succeeded in a task, he would inspect her work with a critical eye and dismiss her efforts as inadequate or slow. His language was calculated to deny her any sense of competence and to render her tireless effort invisible. What should have been simple household maintenance was transformed into a form of ritualized daily humiliation. This calculated cruelty extended beyond the private confines of the estate into the semi-public sphere. On several occasions, Alistair invited neighbors and business acquaintances to the house, not for genuine hospitality, but for a twisted form of demonstration. During these gatherings, Isolde was forced to serve food and wine to the guests, to fetch items on command, and in one particularly egregious instance to kneel and clean the hearth before their very eyes while they talked of politics and finance. Her position was made deliberately and painfully ambiguous. She was neither wife nor servant, but a living spectacle, a testament to his absolute power. One visitor, a merchant from a nearby town, later described the scene in a private letter to his wife that has survived. "It was profoundly uncomfortable to witness," he wrote. "The girl, for she is little more than that, carried trays of port and glasses larger than her arms could securely bear. Her face was pale, her silence complete." Finch laughed at her awkwardness as if it were a form of light entertainment. "Those of us present understood it as cruelty," the letter noted. "Yet none of us spoke, for he was our host, and she by law and custom his possession." This pattern illustrates a common, if extreme, form of control in marriages of great disparity during the 19th century. Where affection was absent, dominance often filled the void. A wife could be silenced and controlled not only through neglect but through these ritualized displays of subordination. Isolde's public humiliation served to reinforce Alistair's absolute authority, both within the household and before the wider community. By treating her as an object of ridicule, he demonstrated his complete mastery over both his property and his person, daring anyone to challenge him. For Isolde, the psychological effect was cumulative and crushing. Each command stripped her further of her identity. Each public performance of obedience narrowed the already thin boundary between herself and her servitude neighbors. Who had once whispered of her absence now began to speak with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination of her degradation. Servants, though instructed not to intervene, quietly carried the stories of her treatment beyond the estate walls. In the parlors and taverns of Coldstream, the phrase, "the Finch girl," became a grim shorthand for a wife who was present only to be demeaned, a cautionary tale for fathers with debts. The cruelty was deliberate, consistent, and methodical. It bore the hallmarks not of sudden, unpredictable passion or anger, but of a cold, calculated practice. It suggested that Alistair derived a perverse and deep-seated satisfaction less from her labor than from her abasement. His cruelty was not mere neglect. It was an orchestration. Thus, the household shifted from oppressive silence to public spectacle. What began as an invisible union became a visible degradation, rehearsed and repeated until it was woven into the very fabric of the estate. It was no longer neglect. It was a performance of power, with Isolde as its unwilling, silent, and slowly breaking star. By the relentlessly bleak winter of 1821, Isolde Thorne's terrible transformation from a child into chattel was complete and apparent to all who observed her. The progression had been gradual, almost imperceptible on a day-to-day basis, but its cumulative effect was devastating. It was measured in 1,000 daily humiliations, in a constant stream of commands and corrections that had steadily eroded her identity until obedience became a pre-programmed reflex. Under Alistair Finch's unyielding and cruel authority, she no longer responded as a person negotiating her place in the world. With thoughts and feelings of her own, she functioned as a mechanism reacting to external stimuli, a biological automaton. The servants provided the earliest and most intimate accounts of this profound psychological decline. They noted that Isolde now rose before dawn without being prompted, her body conditioned to the rhythm of her servitude. She began to anticipate Alistair's demands before he even voiced them, fetching his boots before he called for them, ensuring the fire was stoked to his liking before he complained of the cold. She executed her tasks with the rigid, unthinking precision of a machine rather than the natural variance of human choice. Her movements, once merely uncertain and hesitant, became robotic and mechanical. She carried, fetched, and cleaned without any discernible expression, her face a blank mask. Her deep, profound silence was now only broken by the required whispered responses of, "Yes, sir," or "No, sir." The effect of this change was visible beyond the high stone walls of Blackwood Manor neighbors who glimpsed her by the water pump in the courtyard or, on rare occasions, saw her figure in a distant window remarked on her profound, unnerving detachment. She did not return greetings beyond a brief, automatic nod, her eyes never making contact. She did not linger in conversation or respond to pleasantries. One local farmer's wife, a woman known for her sharp observations, described her as hollow-eyed, like a creature that has been trained to follow rather than to live. This comparison, stark and deeply dehumanizing, quickly spread through the town in kitchen whispers and tavern talk. Isolde was likened to livestock, a beast of burden that obeyed without question, that endured without complaint. The description hardened into a cruel, unofficial name when Alistair himself, at a gathering of local landowners, referred to her simply as "my goat." The remark was made in what he presented as jest, delivered with a smug smile as several guests watched her kneel to scrub a wine stain from the stone floor at their feet. Laughter followed. Not because the company approved of the cruelty, but because in that time and place silence in the face of a wealthy host's ridicule was considered more dangerous than complicity. To challenge him would be to risk his ire, and no one was willing to do so for the sake of a girl who was, for all intents and purposes, his property. From that moment, the label endured. It attached itself to her with a vicious tenacity. Servants began to repeat it in hushed tones amongst themselves. Neighbors, hearing the story, echoed it. And most tragically, Isolde herself seemed to absorb it into the very core of her being. The cruelty lay not just in the insult itself, but in its permanence and public acceptance. Clinical analysis of humiliation as a method of psychological control highlights its efficacy through public visibility and repetition. By reducing Isolde to an animalistic comparison in a public forum, Alistair ensured her degradation was not confined to private moments of abuse, but was reinforced by communal acknowledgement. Each time the name was spoken, even in pity, her human identity was diminished further. Isolde's behavior came to reflect the complete internalization of this role. Accounts suggest she ceased showing any sign of resisting her tasks, even those most physically demanding or demeaning for her station and age. She carried heavy buckets of water from the well until her shoulders ached, without complaint. She scrubbed hearths until her hands were blistered and raw, the skin cracking in the cold air. She stood in absolute unnerving silence while Alistair and his guests ridiculed her clumsiness or her plain appearance. Her lack of protest was not evidence of acceptance, but of a deeper, more profound surrender. It was the instinctive retreat into absolute obedience when any form of opposition, even a flicker of defiance in her eyes, brought only harsher reprisals. The servants, though some may have felt a flicker of sympathy, ultimately reinforced the pattern through their own inaction and linguistic choices. She was no longer addressed as Mrs. Finch, the title that legally belonged to her. In the kitchen, she was simply the girl, a choice of words that denied her both her maturity and her marital status. Within the rigid social structure of the estate, she now held a position lower than that of the hired staff. Without authority, without pay, and without a voice, she was a thing to be managed, not a person to be acknowledged. This stage of degradation marked the midpoint of her precipitous decline. Neglect had erased her public presence. Cruelty had reshaped her behavior. Now public mockery had all but extinguished her identity. By the early months of 1822, Isolde Thorne was no longer recognized as the young bride of a notable estate. She existed, both in her own mind and in the eyes of the community, only as property animated by commands. The name, the Goat, clung to her like a brand, searing away what was left of the child she once was, leaving only a hollow shell of compliance. In the late spring of 1822, as the harsh Northumberland winter finally began to recede, an incident occurred just outside the gates of the Finch estate that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Isolde Thorne's condition. It was an event that neither involved her husband nor was it directed at her. It was an incidental, almost trivial moment of public violence that might have passed entirely unnoticed by the town had she not been there to witness it. Yet its impression on her psyche was decisive and profound. The incident took place on a narrow, muddy lane near the estate boundary. Isolde, dispatched on an errand by Alistair to fetch some item from the village, was walking in her usual manner. Head lowered, pace unhurried, her presence as inconspicuous as a shadow. It was here, as she rounded a bend, that she encountered the scene. An elderly woman, slight in frame and stooped with age, being cornered by a large, desperate-looking man who smelled of drink and had a knife in his hand. His demand was brutal and immediate: her purse, her shawl, whatever coin she carried. What followed did not conform to Isolde's deeply conditioned understanding of the world. The woman, though visibly frail and with no one to help her, resisted. She did not scream and cower. She did not immediately surrender her meager belongings. Instead, she struck the thief with a sudden, surprising force, clawing at his arm with her free hand and shouting with a voice that was far louder and fiercer than her small frame suggested. The confrontation was disorderly, brief, and violent. Startled by the sheer volume of her shouts and the unexpected ferocity of her resistance, the man faltered. He was prepared for tears and pleading, not for a fight. Witnesses who were drawn by the noise later recorded that he cursed, hesitated, and then fled down the lane empty-handed, leaving the old woman shaken but physically intact, her meager possessions preserved. For Isolde, watching from a distance behind a thicket of gorse, the sight was profoundly jarring. Conditioned by years of systematic abuse to a state of learned helplessness, to withdrawal, silence, and absolute obedience, she had come to associate weakness with the inevitability of submission. What she had just observed contradicted this core, deeply ingrained belief. A woman marked by age and poverty, whose circumstances offered even less defense than her own, had resisted an armed man, and had prevailed. The outcome was not some grand, heroic triumph, but something more fundamental and more powerful: survival, secured through an act of pure refusal. Accounts from those who saw her there suggest Isolde lingered after the event, standing at a distance as the old woman collected her scattered belongings and adjusted her shawl, muttering angrily to herself. No words passed between them. Isolde remained a silent observer, not a participant, yet the impression was deeply and permanently fixed in her mind. The image of the old woman's fierce, defiant face was burned into her memory. The significance of this moment lay not in the minor, failed robbery itself, but in its profound psychological effect on Isolde. Until that point, she had understood herself as utterly powerless, an object to be acted upon, reduced to a state of pure obedience by command and ridicule. The old woman's resistance demonstrated a radical, electrifying alternative: that apparent weakness did not automatically equal helplessness, and that survival was possible even when faced with a direct physical threat. It suggested that the will to resist was a weapon in itself. A clinical assessment of such moments in the lives of trauma victims suggests they can operate as powerful catalysts, capable of shifting an individual's core perception from one of inevitability to one of possibility. For Isolde, the incident disrupted the brutal, seemingly unbreakable pattern that had governed her existence for years. It was a crack in the prison wall of her consciousness she began to recognize, perhaps for the first time since her wedding day, that endurance was not her sole option. The simple, raw observation of resistance had opened a conceptual space in her mind for the possibility of her own. In the days and weeks that followed, servants noted subtle, almost imperceptible changes in her demeanor. Isolde moved with a greater deliberation. Her silence, once vacant and defeated, now seemed watchful and contemplative. She did not openly resist Alistair's commands or alter her routines, but her compliance no longer carried the same mechanical, empty quality. She appeared, as one maid later described it in a hushed tone, to be listening inwardly, as if waiting for something not yet spoken, or perhaps formulating a thought of her own for the first time in years. The robbery itself quickly faded from local record, a minor footnote in the town's daily life, soon forgotten. But within the oppressive confines of Blackwood Manor, its echo persisted, resonating in the mind of its most silent resident. Isolde Thorne had witnessed an act of resistance and its success. For the first time in a very long time, she began to consider the possibility of her own. The question, a dangerous and revolutionary seed, had been planted in the barren soil of her mind. If weakness could fight, why couldn't she? By the high summer of 1822, Isolde Thorne had endured more than 2 years of ceaseless humiliation, labor, and neglect. The incident she had witnessed on the lane, the frail old woman resisting her attacker, had planted a dangerous and revolutionary idea. That silence was not the only response to cruelty. That faint initial spark of possibility was carried into her daily thoughts, a secret ember she nursed in the cold hearth of her mind. Over weeks of silent, intense contemplation, as she scrubbed floors and polished boots, it hardened from a fleeting thought into a single, momentous, and terrifying decision. She would attempt to speak. The opportunity, or perhaps the breaking point, arose in late July, upon Alistair Finch's return from a week's absence in Derby. He found Isolde at her usual place by the main hall's hearth, her hands raw and red from scrubbing the soot-stained stones. According to accounts later preserved through the fragmented and fearful testimony of servants, she rose from her knees not with her usual cowed posture, but with an unusual and unsettling steadiness. For the first time in their marriage, she initiated words of her own. Her statement was not dramatic or hysterical. It was measured, spoken in a low, flat voice that was all the more shocking for its control. She told him plainly that their union was a sham, that he had treated her not as a wife but as a possession, and that she had lived in silence while being degraded and mocked by him and his acquaintances. She did not ask for freedom, an idea too vast and impossible to contemplate. She asked for a sliver of dignity. Her precise request, as pieced together by those who overheard it, was for a recognition of her role as a wife rather than a spectacle of his power. Alistair's initial response was a burst of sharp, unrestrained laughter. Witnesses described it as the cruel, incredulous laughter of a man who found utter absurdity in the very notion of her appeal. He called her child, his voice dripping with contempt, contemptuously reminding her of her place and her age. He told her she mistook herself for something greater than a debt repaid in human form. His tone carried a cold amusement, but beneath it lay a condescension that was sharpened into a palpable threat. The exchange might have ended there, with her silenced once more, her small rebellion crushed. But something in Isolde had irrevocably broken, or perhaps hardened. She repeated herself. She insisted, her voice firmer this time, rising slightly above a whisper, that she could not continue in this way, that a life lived in constant degradation was no life at all. It was at this second assertion, this refusal to be immediately silenced, that Alistair's amusement gave way to a sudden, violent fury. His rage was explosive, a dam of contempt bursting. He seized her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and dragged her from the hearth toward the main doorway, his voice rising with each stride. The few servants present, startled by the sudden violence, moved aside like frightened mice as he pulled her through the long corridor and out into the main courtyard. His words were no longer measured but shouted, a torrent of abuse filled with accusations of ingratitude and mockery of her presumption. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of his shouting, later reported hearing the commotion. In the street just beyond the estate's main gate, Alistair escalated his assault. He struck her across the face, a sharp, cracking blow that sent her stumbling. He did so before the eyes of the townsfolk who had gathered at the sound of his rage. He then forced her to her knees on the rough cobblestones, bellowing that she was nothing but an animal and that she belonged to him as completely as the very soil he owned. The public nature of this assault was entirely deliberate. Where her humiliation had once been confined to the semi-private gatherings of his choosing, it was now openly and brutally displayed for the entire town to see. It was a raw, undisguised performance of absolute mastery, intended to silence not only Isolde but any whisper of her burgeoning resistance, and to serve as a warning to the community itself. The effect was immediate and devastating. Isolde, bruised, bleeding from her lip and deeply publicly shamed, was dragged back into the house. The disturbed neighbors offered no intervention. In 19th century Coldstream, a husband's authority within a marriage was regarded as nearly absolute, a private kingdom where outsiders, even the law, hesitated to tread. What was seen that day was spoken of in quiet, horrified whispers behind closed doors, but it was never challenged. From a clinical perspective, the event marked a critical and final escalation. Alistair's cruelty had shifted from private, psychological ridicule to public, physical violence. This transition served to reinforce the brutal hierarchy of their relationship in the most visceral way possible, binding Isolde even more tightly to her role as a possession. For Isolde, the lesson was unmistakable and absolute. Words would not alter her condition. Reason would not deliver recognition. Her desperate, fragile attempt to claim a shred of human dignity had ended not with dialogue, but with blows in the street. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt, the taste of her own blood in her mouth, Isolde Thorne understood that reason would never deliver her freedom. Something else, something far darker and more silent, would have to. After the public humiliation in the summer of 1822, Isolde Thorne ceased her attempts at speech entirely. The brutal confrontation had demonstrated with stark, irrefutable clarity that words held no weight against Alistair Finch's authority. What little courage she had gathered from the old woman on the lane was shattered in the street, reduced to the fading bruises on her skin and the pitying, helpless whispers of neighbors. Yet within the profound, death-like silence that followed, something fundamental shifted. Isolde's despair did not collapse back into the passive, mechanical obedience it had been before. Instead, it hardened into a cold, crystalline resolve. Her compliance, once a sign of defeat, now became a perfect mask for meticulous observation. She began to listen with a new and chilling precision to the rhythms of the household. She noted the hours Alistair was present, the times he dined, the patterns of his habits, the specific wines he favored, and the quantity he consumed each night. Servants reported that she moved as quietly and unobtrusively as ever, but with a sharp, unnerving attentiveness that suggested a hidden and constant calculation. What appeared to the world as docile, broken submission now concealed a slowly evolving, lethal strategy. Clinical studies of human endurance under conditions of prolonged, extreme cruelty suggest that victims often pass through distinct psychological stages: initial resistance, learned submission, despair, and finally, for some, a chilling adaptation through methodical planning. Isolde's psychological progression followed this dark path to its final station. Her rage, once an unarticulated and inward-burning fire, began to crystallize into deliberate, focused thought. She no longer asked why she suffered. She began to ask how that suffering might be brought to a permanent end. The method she began to consider was not impulsive. It was cold, logical, and born of her powerlessness. She did not imagine flight. Her years of isolation had left her with no means, no money, and no allies in the outside world. She did not imagine another direct confrontation. Experience had taught her the futility of words and the certainty of violent reprisal. What remained was subtlety. An end delivered quietly, invisibly under the familiar guise of daily routine. Poison presented itself as the only viable solution. It required no open conflict, no physical strength, and if executed with perfect care, no witnesses. In its essence, it was a dark extension of her current condition, methodical, concealed, and utterly silent. Accounts from the period suggest Isolde began to observe not only Alistair's habits, but also the various tinctures and herbs kept within the estate for medicinal purposes. Country households of the time often maintained extensive stores of such plants. Belladonna for pain, foxglove for heart ailments, hemlock for poultices. Their dangers were well known, even if their legitimate use was accepted. Neighbors later recalled seeing Isolde purchasing certain herbs at the market ostensibly for use in household remedies. No suspicion was raised, as a basic knowledge of simple herbal cures was common for women of the era. What was uncommon was the cold, focused intent with which she gathered them. Her silence at the stalls, her careful selection of plants, her measured questions about their properties, all pointed not to simple curiosity but to a chilling and specific design. Her demeanor within the estate reflected the same profound shift. Servants noted she no longer flinched at Alistair's sudden commands. She carried out her tasks with a new, unnerving composure, neither hurried nor hesitant. Her eyes, once described as vacant or hollow, now carried a deep, unnerving stillness that made some of the staff uncomfortable. It was as if she had retreated deep within herself, conducting complex and invisible calculations. From a detached perspective, this stage marked the terrifying conversion of suffering into agency. Isolde's condition had stripped her of her dignity, her identity, and her speech. What remained was intent, a cold, deliberate shaping of the future through the only means available to her. The choice of poison was not merely practical, it was deeply symbolic. Just as her degradation had been administered slowly and invisibly through 1,000 repeated humiliations, so too would her response be gradual and unseen, until a final, irreversible outcome was achieved. She confided in no one. No record, no diary, no whispered confession suggests she ever spoke of her dark thoughts. The evidence lies only in her subtly altered behavior and the later outcome of her plan. But those who studied her life in subsequent years agreed that the critical transition occurred during this period, the moment when despair no longer dissolved her, but refined her into a weapon of pure, silent calculation. Isolde's silence was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of preparation. By the late autumn of 1822, Isolde Thorne's plan had matured from cold calculation into imminent action. Months of careful preparation and silent, meticulous observation converged into a single, unalterable course. Alistair Finch would die by poison, administered in plain sight during the ordinary, unremarkable rituals of his own household. The tools of her design were not exotic. They were derived from the very garden of the estate. Her method was incremental and scientific in its precision. She studied the tastes and textures of the herbs, testing minute quantities in leftover wine and broth to observe their level of concealment and bitterness. Servants later recalled her lingering at the kitchen hearth, stirring pots with an unusual focus or requesting measures of strong spices to, as she claimed, mask the gamey flavor of meat. These actions aroused no suspicion. In a household where the master demanded constant labor, it was not unusual for a wife to extend her duties into the kitchen. The timing of the act was precise. Alistair drank heavily, especially in the evenings after his meals. Wine provided the perfect vehicle, rich in aroma, strong in taste, and capable of concealing even the most bitter tinctures. Isolde selected a quiet night when the household was calm, The servants were beginning to disperse to their own quarters, and Alistair was already softened and made careless by drink. The moment itself was chillingly ordinary. Alistair sat at the head of the long dining table, his boots still marked with the dirt of the courtyard, his voice issuing commands. Isolde poured the wine without a hint of hesitation. Her silence unbroken, her hands perfectly steady. Into his cup she introduced the dose. A carefully measured tincture designed not to kill instantly but to weaken gradually, allowing the scene to unfold as if a sudden illness or exhaustion had overtaken him. Alistair raised the cup to his lips entirely unaware. He swallowed, then paused, remarking that the wine was uncommonly smooth that evening. The words, recorded later by a nearby servant, carried the cruelest irony. Each compliment was directed not at the vineyard's craft, but at the very substance that was beginning to end his life. Isolde, standing in the shadows beside him, betrayed no reaction. The poison's progression was slow, just as she had planned. As Alistair's strength finally ebbed, he leaned back in his chair, muttering that the wine carried an unusual depth. It was his final compliment. His hand released the cup, which struck the table and rolled, spilling a dark red stain across the polished wood. His eyes closed, his body sagged into the chair, and the household at last entered a new final silence. The death of Alistair Finch presented Isolde with a problem that demanded immediate resolution. A poison, if left unexplained, risked suspicion. To secure her escape, Isolde needed to convert a private death into a public crime. The solution lay in staging. The confrontation with the creditors weeks earlier had supplied both motive and menace. If Alistair's body were discovered in the open, marked with signs of retribution, suspicion would naturally fall upon them. The grim work began after midnight. The house was silent. Alistair's body remained at the dining table. Isolde moved with steady calculation. She dragged him first through the hall, then into the sharp night air. The streets of Coldstream were deserted. She moved in shadow, guiding the body along narrow lanes. Her path led toward the market square, where discovery would be swiftest at dawn. There, under the church tower's shadow, she left him. Before stepping away, she produced the final element of her design, a note, written in a careful but unpracticed hand, bearing a warning she wished to attribute to his creditors. It read, "This is the fate of men who fail their debts." The words were pinned to his coat. She then retraced her path, her face expressionless, her steps measured. Back in her chamber, she extinguished the lamp and lay in silence, waiting for the dawn. When the body was discovered, the town was unsettled but not surprised. The narrative was fixed. Alistair Finch had been killed in retribution. Isolde, at 14, was cast as the tragic victim. At the funeral, her performance was flawless. She wept openly, her grief appearing utterly genuine. A colder analysis reveals a pattern of careful performance, her tears falling at precise moments. The community responded with pity and support. Her manipulation lay not in words, but in silence. She allowed others to speak of her as the poor widow, and each title became a shield. The inquiry that followed was brief and inconclusive. The creditors denied responsibility, but their reputations weakened them. The town divided, but suspicion failed to solidify around Isolde. The very absence of proof became her greatest defense. The inquiry concluded without charges. The creditors bore the weight of suspicion. Their trade suffering, Isolde emerged untouched, her position recast from degraded wife to pitied widow. Coldstream had sought justice, but justice never found her. With the inquiry over, Isolde Thorne entered a new phase of existence. At 14, she was both widow and heiress. The house that had been her prison now became her platform. She assumed the duties of mistress with a composure that unnerved some but impressed most. Yet beneath the surface, traces of trauma remained. She paced the corridors at night, ate sparingly, and startled at sudden noises. She had gained control of her circumstances, but not freedom from their imprint. In the decades that followed, Isolde Thorne never left Coldstream. She managed the estate with quiet efficiency. Remaining a dignified, reserved, and solitary figure, she never remarried. The town remembered her in two conflicting narratives. To some, she was the tragic child bride who endured unimaginable suffering and emerged with dignity. To others, the doubters, she was a figure of cold calculation. They recalled her unsettling calmness, her perfectly timed tears, and the sheer convenience of the note they whispered that she had seized an opportunity, expertly framing the creditors to secure her own terrible freedom. No proof ever surfaced. The poison left no trace. The inquiry closed, leaving only speculation. Isolde herself never spoke of that night. Her silence, once a symptom of oppression, became the ultimate guardian of her secrets. The truth, whatever it was, remained sealed behind her impenetrable composure. Isolde Thorne died in 1852 at the age of 53. Her burial was attended by townsfolk who still spoke of her simply as the widow. The estate passed to distant relatives, her line extinguished. Yet even at her grave, the central question of her life lingered. Who had she truly been? Was she the child sold into darkness, marked forever by a cruelty she never invited? Or was she the calculating widow who turned humiliation into strategy, transforming poison into freedom? History remembers her as the Widow of Coldstream, but cannot decide whether to condemn or absolve her. Her story ends as it was lived, in silence. Was she consumed by rage, or was she freed by courage? That is an answer that may never be known. What do you think? Was Isolde a victim or a mastermind? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you seek more tales of dark history and complex psychological horror, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Rite of Fear, and ring the bell for notifications. The past is never truly dead, and it has more stories to tell.